I would also kind of add how hard it is for humans to kind of understand and conceive climate change too, which I think makes it complex, because it does necessitate human action, human delivery and design. It's way more difficult that these are really large concepts that, you know, there's studies that show that even our brains can't fully comprehend what these impacts look like. And because of that, you know, that can lead to inaction. So it adds to the layer of complexity as well.
Yeah. I think another thing I would add is that when we talk about climate vulnerability, it's a function of exposure, which is kind of where you are, the geography, sensitivity, so what personal sensitivities do you have? Are you, do you already have health issues? Do you have other kinds of challenges that would make you more sensitive to impacts? And then adaptive capacity, and that's like what resources are at your disposal. So, you know, if you're thinking about communities on the coast that could potentially be exposed to coastal erosion and sea level rise, a community in Southern California, let's say, that is perhaps more wealthy, has more resources at their disposal, and could be more prepared, could take measures to kind of bolster and prepare themselves in their home, versus, let's say, a rural community on the Oregon coast or Washington coast that just doesn't have as many resources at their disposal, maybe more complicated transportation infrastructure or just like lack thereof. So that in of itself is trying to figure out what to do about impacts is challenging, because there are all these different layers added on.
Anything else on that one? I'm hearing migration, it's hard for us to picture, and also around equity, like not everyone has the same access to kind of adapting to climate change. Oregon, Los Angeles, those kinds of things.
I think it's really hard to grasp. I think it's really hard for people to grasp what's going on. I mean, we see the results in the climate assessment report that came out, in the IPCC report, and it just feels like, oh my God, this is happening, but what do we do about it? And it feels so far removed. I mean, I know with my students in New York, I mean, we really had a hard time getting into it, because it's like, it feels really intimidating. Climate change, what does it mean, right? And I think it feels like there's something that's looming, that's on the horizon, but like we feel we can't do enough about it. And so that also really makes it complex, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny, the equity component really resonates with me too, because also the way we talk about climate change can sometimes not be effective to groups, and in a lot of ways you can do research on sort of what could look like an elitist type of problem, right, or like highly intellectual that sort of isolates those from really understanding how that affects their day-to-day life. So, and these are complex principles, so there's gonna be a need for really complex discussions around it, but there also has to be very clear and real discussion to everyone on how it affects their daily lives. So it has to sort of function on so many different levels. And sometimes, you know, in different environments, I think when we talk about equity, these discussions kind of stay at this level of like having the PhDs and I'm an engineer by training, and kind of getting into the data, and which is important, but when we're trying to relate to students or citizens of Oakland, you have to understand how to deliver that message in a way that makes sense, which is complex in itself, right? So,
and also deliver that message in a way that can kind of overcome the barriers that are imposed by making climate change a political thing, an economic thing, a belief system, instead of talking about what's really happening and accepting that.
Yeah.
Wow, cool. I had originally asked that question because it was kind of, when you think about service design and climate change, there's a kind of implication that it's complex, so I wanted to hear more about that, you know, as if service design might be able to get involved somehow in that, helping with that complexity. So that's not a question, I'm just throwing that out there. Okay, so cool, because that leads us into, you've already brought it up, Alex, you're touching on equity. So when we think about, you know, why is equity so important in planning for climate change? And then what does an equity-driven climate change planning process look and feel like? So sorry if I'm reading, I'm definitely, anyway. So
Yeah.
who wants to start on that one?
I'd love to start because
Okay.
Oakland is doing some really innovative things around what equity and climate change looks like. First, any Oaklanders in the audience? Okay, there we go. All right. So I think the city is really known for really being innovative. We're one of the most diverse cities in the Bay Area, have a history that's very rich. And we also, because of that, Oakland became the first California city to have an Office of Race and Equity, a Department of Race and Equity. So we actually have a director level professional who's working in the government and thinking about, for all the work that the city does, how race and equity overlays that. And I work closely with her, our offices work closely together. So specifically to your question, Sophie, Oakland is doing an energy climate action plan update. We issued our plan, like most cities have climate plans. But Oakland is one of the first cities, at least to our knowledge, that from the inception of the planning, we actually have, first we're searching for a consultant, a traditional climate consultant that helps prepare and write the plan, which you see again in most cities. But we actually have allocated funds to an equity consultant who is working in partnership with this climate consultant, and from the inception of the work are working together to come up with plans, metrics, recommendations, and also just outreach to the community to come up with these solutions. So we use the term procedural equity as a way to just say, like in the procedure, in the way we operate, how can we design ourselves to lend the process to be more equitable versus what cities have done in the past, or Oakland has even done in the past. We put together a great plan, we have our technical experts provide some really great recommendations, and then we go to the community who are really experts in West Oakland and East Oakland who all have their different fields, and they are sort of reacting to something that they didn't have input in, and that usually doesn't solve the problem because a lot of the work we're doing is a behavioral change, and a lot of when we start solving these issues, it's really about a change in behavior. And if that's the case, then we need to get everyone at the table as early as possible so that we're able to speak the language and design a solution that's better. So I'm really excited that Oakland is kind of thinking of it, and I think in a way that I hope more cities start doing.
Yes, you're definitely a template for us all, right?
Yeah, and I think at its heart, I think the service design is about participatory design and involving people in the design process, and also really creating ownership in the design process. So not only inviting people in, but creating ownership of that design process too. And so, and of the end result that you are designing, that you're co-designing. And so, for our work in Red Hook in New York, we designed a model for collaborative service around disaster preparedness. So this is a neighborhood that was in the floodplain and really badly hit by Hurricane Sandy. And it took FEMA and all of the OEM, everyone, like over a week to get there. So the neighborhood was really cut off from services, flooded badly. People were isolated in their homes with no way to get out, no way to evacuate if you were on oxygen or you had a disability, for instance. So that's where our work grew out of a grassroots medical relief effort there. And so we worked with residents, we had workshops and co-design sessions and interviews based on people's experience during Sandy, and how can we create something that's a networked approach that's neighborhood-wide that can also connect to those citywide services and those local services and organizations, and kind of create an infrastructure of support. And so for us, it was really important to make equity the foundation of our work. But what was so interesting was if we felt that we were working so much against the grain of things that had happened already in the neighborhood, and like these continuous sort of traumas of like efforts that people just kind of go in and do community engagement, or where they said people are like, I'm weary, I don't want to talk about that, and I don't want to talk about my experience during Sandy, because the same thing's going to happen. And so it was really challenging work, really interesting, but I think equity has to be at the foundation of this work, and I think that service design, there's so many opportunities for service designers to work in this space too.
Yeah, I'll jump in and I guess kind of touching on the first question, or the first part of the question of why is equity so important. I feel like kind of in some way even posing the question is a bit complicated because it suggests that needs to be answered. When you look at climate change, the way that climate change impacts being experienced is 100% based on where you live, what resources are available, what your health conditions are right now, and the list goes on, your economic status, exactly. So it's not really a question.
Yeah.
That's just how it's being realized on the ground right now. And the sooner more cities start taking an approach like Oakland's, the better, because then we're going to be addressing kind of the root causes of vulnerability and lack of resilience, and can really start to create a pathway for us to move forward in a truly more resilient way, which I think is really exciting. I think some cities that do not have the resources to do that, perhaps, and have a great department on its own working on that, and then bridge that together in a climate action plan or resilience plan, can still leverage grants and other things to do that work, and be creative. Like, one of our projects is working in Missouri on a climate action plan, and they had previously done an equity assessment in the city to inform their community development efforts, and so we were able to leverage that research that was done just the year prior into our work, and to inform that planning process, and work with their equity consultant that had been leading that process. So there are creative ways to do it, but it definitely needs to happen.
Your point resonates so well, because I think a lot of times we don't understand the systematic sort of issues in place. To your point, like why we have to ask why equity is important is because there are systems in America, and I'll speak mostly in the U.S., that have limited based on race, based on gender, based on class. And when you talk about deconstructing those systems, that can't be done with just one, and even what we're experiencing now in Oakland, which we haven't started the process yet, but we have to understand, to your point, Erin's point, people are tired of hearing from us and hearing about plans. There's a mistrust in government. So it's when we talk about systems, like maybe the next session can be how service design can wrangle like racism, because you can't talk about climate change and not talk about sort of the intersections of like race and equity. And equity is the buzz term right now. I think a lot of people are using the term. Before that, it was diversity and inclusion, and I think not a lot of people, but people are using it as like an add-on to the discussion and not the foundation. So yeah, it's a lot of work. It's, again, we have the resources in Oakland where we have like our director of race and equity that tells us that it's not going to happen in our lifetime, the types of changes we'd like to see, but we're just going to have to chip away, which is sort of like climate change too. So, but yeah, those points really resonated with me, because there's a lot of work to do, and even with this work we're doing in Oakland, kind of leading, I don't expect it to be perfect, because we're going against people who have been traumatized and disinvested in by the government and the systems in place around them. So yeah, not to make it sad.
It's a very happy topic. Actually, I'm glad you brought this up, because I was gonna ask, well, what is equity really?
Yeah.
Because we use language a lot of times that can kind of like get in the way of really. Not all of us use the word equity in our day-to-day, lives, right? Depends on the work that we're doing. So, anyway, that's kind of taking us off script. Does anyone want to answer? You sort of answered that question.
Well, I'd like Alice to talk more about procedural equity.
Yeah.
How to take that apart.
Well, I guess.
Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, well, I guess the first step in what is equity, everyone has maybe seen that basic diagram that I think most people have, where essentially there's a fence. I wish I had the picture, but there's a fence, and there are like 3 kids who are different heights, right? Equality is giving the same box to each person. So the short kid still can't see over the fence with this box, but the tall kid who can see already can see even better. Equity is about assessing how tall this kid is and giving him or her the box to then allow them to see over the fence. So I guess procedural equity is that procedure, and like getting to know who this person is, getting to know their height, getting to know their capacity, what their needs are, and allowing them to help you come up with the best solution. And my favorite, we have a new diagram now where there's someone in a wheelchair, which like they might, the boxes doesn't help. So what are, so the complications of first getting access to these, getting access to the community you're trying to serve is the first part, and then assessing and understanding and listening, which, traditionally a lot of people aren't good at. And so yeah, the procedural piece is making sure that not only are you going out there to speak to the person, but what checks and balances do you have to make sure that you can continue to provide the appropriate solution as the kid grows up and gets taller or shorter. There's like tons of ways to map it. But yeah, that's kind of maybe my first description of how I would quickly describe procedural equity. I don't know if you guys better suggested. That was my first pass.
No, it's good.
Yeah, and I think as designers, I think our role is to really change this business as usual, right?
Yeah.
This idea of like community engagement, a workshop with residents, and we'll just like sweep in, do a couple mapping exercises, and then then leave. And we've done our community engagement, right? But I think our task as designers is to really change this dialogue. And it's about listening, it's about being there, it's about, my voice is a little off, sorry. It's about building trust, and it's also about staying power. So it's about working on projects that have that staying power, that you're going to be there and you aren't necessarily just going to leave, right? Or I think that this piece is really, really important as designers. I think that's kind of our role, is how can we work in this way. Yeah.
So this is a little more great responses, by the way. Thinking about something a little bit more tactical, like let's talk about what are we doing right now in this work. So what does climate adaptation planning look like now in communities and cities, and, in terms of regional and scale approaches. So Erin, do you want to start with that?
Well, I think these two could speak more to it than I can, but I'll just say that I think it's very sorry, my voice. I hope you can hear me in the back. I feel like climate change planning is very top down right now.
Yeah.
And I think in the planning, but also when you think about disaster preparedness, right? It's you go to a website and it's like, here's how to make your go back. And I'm skeptical about how many people actually go into the website and look by the step-by-step process and make a go back. So I think that's, I think it is very top down in that way.
Yeah, to add to that, I think a big part of it is it's very focused on data and getting the numbers down. Oftentimes, in my experience, in the work that we do, cities are really eager to figure out exactly how many emissions do we, like what is our emissions inventory, what's our target need to be. We need to figure out exactly what that's going to be, where are the impacts going to happen and when, and just really focus on the data, which is important. Like, we acknowledge that, yes. But to be frank, we kind of know what the anticipated impacts will be, and we can tell you without really doing a full inventory probably where you need to put your effort behind to reduce your emissions and to kind of tackle big adaptation issues. So there's a lot of energy and resources being put into getting all of this information and a bit of spinning the wheels. And then once you do have this information, then it's kind of going through the laundry list of strategies that could potentially be taken, and maybe selecting a lot, like too many that is actually practical to implement. So that's not everywhere, obviously, but that kind of tends to be a trend. And it's, in the meantime, community members, like Erin was saying, don't always get a robust kind of role in the process. So it's like, maybe they're reviewing or giving some input, a lot of being informed about what's happening, kind of playing maybe a consult type of role in the spectrum of public participation. but they're not necessarily empowered in the process in all times. And I think those are some key areas of like, where do we put the effort? Is it behind making sure we have 100% certainty around what's happening here and what we need to do, or do we put it into taking action and trusting what we do know and moving forward and getting other people involved?
I'd love to hear a more specific example, like this is certainty and this is taking action. Like, what's the difference? What would that look like?
Yeah.
I'm not in your day to day, so
Yeah.
I'd love to get a picture of that.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, I think one example, so we could talk about like the heat index, right? Air quality and heat. That's pretty common in cities. And so, you could spend a lot of time trying to get downscaled models to figure out in your specific city, what are those temperature ranges going to be? What would we expect? And we don't really need to get that specific of information to know it's going to be hot.
Right.
There are going to be more days when the heat index is really high. That's going to happen. And on those days, air quality is going to be poor. And the people who have already health issues are going to struggle more. So, instead of like worrying about what are those numbers and where in the city are there going to be the heat island effects, which is important. I'm not trying to say that science isn't important, obviously. But why don't we think about, okay, where can we create cooling centers? Where are the places in our city that are kind of natural gathering places already? Is it the library? Is it transportation centers? Where do people go already? And can we make those more accessible? And can we make them have capacity to be cooling centers when things are really hot and people need a break and they don't have air conditioning in their home? So that's one example of
that's a great
transitioning.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I'm so inspired just by the way you said, and I think that's the type of conversation that we need to have more, just like breaking it down.
Yeah.
I mean, I do want to just, to your question, Sophie, just share what I think the city's doing on a day-to-day. So my role, I think, is an example. So, on a city level, I have coworkers who are literally putting out fires, right? So there's not enough time to do strategy level thinking. So, the idea of having this chief resilience officer, which is sort of like a higher level local official whose job is to consider how to plan for the shocks and stresses of climate change. I think that in itself is a cool design hack that Rockefeller Foundation decided to do, and now I have a network of CROs around the world that we're in our respective cities working on, the similar issues, right? So, for cities on the coastline are dealing with sea level rise, or for, the Bay Area obviously is dealing with, potential earthquake. So the fact that I'm able to share knowledge, this network that they built through higher level officials around the world, is kind of an interesting design in itself to like share best practices. And I do want to, and out of that work, we have the Civic Design Lab, my colleague wasn't able to join us today, but the Civic Design Lab is its own entity, sort of like a consulting office in City Hall, where we have design fellows, a lead creative director, and we take on issues piece by piece. So to your point, Sophie, sometimes, so right now we're looking at parking tickets and what is the process for getting a parking ticket? Which communities are getting hit harder? Are people who who need to pay parking tickets in increments? How are they able to do that? Is there a process to help that? Which then, by thinking of this one little process, it helps with financial empowerment, it helps people have more trust in government. So we're trying to, through this Civic Design Lab, take on specific issues in the city that are just, because of the bureaucracy and having to work in so many silos, you should see the process map of what happens once you get a ticket to sign, and how many different departments have to touch it. And a lot of folks hadn't really seen that, and being able to see that laid out and then decide where we can fix that process. Little things like that I'm excited about, and and for us, people don't necessarily get the link with climate change you might not consider, but if you have more trust, first of all, if you have more resources, if you are more comfortable or feeling better about coming to City Hall, those types of attitudes toward the city government actually helps in a disaster scenario. So it's also just sort of widening the picture of how we can address the trauma, you know, that Erin mentioned, and figure out how to build those relationships.
Yeah, I think increased access to services in the day-to-day is really the key for climate change and for disaster time, right? Because then they're in place and you know where to go, you know who you can lean on. But I think that's what we really need to focus on.
Yeah.
So, great examples. So why, it's kind of coming back to service design, which is, you know, we're all here, we're interested in service design. You know, why is service design so well suited to addressing this? So maybe Erin, you could start.
Okay.
This time I did it right. Okay.
I'll start this one.
Yes.
So I think several reasons that come to mind. First, networked approaches. It's really good at creating networked solutions and networked approaches, which is what we need for a problem, I hate the word problem, but for something as complex as climate change. I think that networked approaches are so important. And number two, participatory design. So really inviting people into the process from the outset. That means people as partners, people being involved in the process, and then thereby creating ownership and transfer of ownership to what you're building, to the service that you're building ultimately. And I think we need collaborative services. So the distinction between services and then also collaborative services, maybe at the community level, I think is really important. And then just a third or fourth thing, just being able to imagine preferred futures. I think design is really well suited to do that. And really, I think almost in a way that other professions really can't. And we need to have that. We need to be able to show people what this could look like, what our preferred future is, right? And I think being able to visualize and show that is so important.
So, can you give an example in your current work? I know you work with the city. Are you doing any services around this, or I mean, is there anything
I work
specific?
for the city of San Francisco right now, but we're working around creating greater access to jobs, so that's one example.
Okay.
For sure, and then taking a networked approach of building capacity of community-based organizations, which is so important when you're trying to create access to jobs, and I think jobs and economy is so linked to climate change as well. So that's what I'm saying.
I just want to double click on one thing you said. Can you just spend a moment talking about networked approaches, just so we all are on the same page with that, like what you mean by that?
Yeah, so if you will, so a networked approach is almost thinking about it like an infrastructure. You're creating an infrastructure of support. I think networked approaches, so even, thinking about design rather than thinking about design as an object, right? Design has moved to this idea of co-design and service design, which is a networked-based approach. One example that I just heard of is something that's happening in Italy, where they actually have these like community ambassadors, essentially, that they've kind of stationed in different towns that find out what the needs are and what needs to happen there, and then help with the community, like co-design sort of like different services to solve that issue. So that's a great example of a networked approach, so decentralized networked approach, if that makes sense.
Thank you, decentralized, that's great, thank you. So actually, Emily, do you want to add to this in any way? I mean, we had kind of one of the questions that I had asked when we talked previously was, why do we need service design to do this isn't this just like talking to people, right? So we had kind of talked about that.
Yeah.
You had a great response to that. So
Yeah,
I'd love to hear.
it's pretty intuitive, right? Like, it makes sense why we would, we were talking about that a bit. Like, this just makes sense that we would take this approach. But I think what really is special is that you get a suite of tools and strategies to get over some of the psychological barriers that exist around around climate change, for sure, and the complex challenges that kind of it poses. So I love that service design approaches can bring us closer to action and kind of encourage being in that space that can kind of feel really uncomfortable, but you just are trying to spin out possible solutions and not get hung up on the judgments that can really come around, like the what ifs and the questioning around that. And aside from that, I think another really awesome aspect is that it brings people together in a new way. So a lot of different elements of the city, people working in different parts of the city and maybe in the community, maybe come together already to do community development planning and other types of planning for the city or the region, but they're coming with their own kind of agendas, right, in their own departments and trying to make sure that they can do what they need to get done, which makes sense. But I think service design really calls on us to step into that space with a fresh mind, right, and kind of check things at the door and like, let's come here together and work together on this issue in a new way. So I think that's what really excites me about it.
Yeah, no, I go back to our first call, Sophie, when I think I said, I'm not a designer, but I went to the new school and I know Parsons and I know like design and I took a class, but I don't get close to saying I'm a designer. But I think with this conversation or this time together has sort of revealed, and Emily and I were talking about this, is that sort of the work I do sort of infers design, right? And it's amazing to have that partnership, right? And while we're talking about why we need to bring service design and climate change together, I mean, the expertise and the approach, I think, is really important to help drive the work. So yeah, I mean, I'm saddened that my colleague is not supposed to come here, or wasn't here, but she wrote a book on service design, and she's running our civic design lab, and together we're working on these issues, and with that expertise, it just works. So I think it's a combination that I'm really excited about, and yeah, I hope to see more designers kind of getting there, getting into city government or to Oakland or just trying it out. But yeah, I think it's an excellent way to think about these issues.
We did have a great example we talked about, which was you're coming from an environmental science background.
Yeah.
You don't have that design lens on things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think it was helpful when you talked a little bit about the data and the numbers and how you look at things and then what does design bring into it that it wouldn't otherwise. I think there was a great example. I can't remember.
Yeah,
what
well,
it was,
I mean, even
maybe.
when Aaron just said you're allowed to like see the future, and I think and the engineering meeting was like, wait, what? So I think there's an ability to sort of disconnect from the, well, how's that going to work, in a way that I think is very, very important. And the training I got, maybe could limit that a little bit, right? Like, because the idea is like solving to the problem versus sort of, seeing the future. What was the term you used? Preferred future. There it is. Yeah. So I think, I think that balance is critical, particularly with such a crazy, wicked problem. You can spin your wheels forever trying to get the best numbers and to come up with the best solutions to a problem that really doesn't have 1, 2, 10, 100 solutions that are, is going to be. So having that balance, I think, is so critical, and a different lens that I think more people need to apply to the work. I've been in so many discussions. I was at the Global Climate Week here in San Francisco. I was even in Paris COP21, and just sort of burdened with data and graphs and, analysis, which is important. But yeah, I think that balance has to happen. And I think that's where I've seen the inspiration sort of happen, in at least on a local level in Oakland, and allowing young people that we interact with to dream and sort of play games and understand what this means for their community or their neighborhood. So it is an important balance that I'm happy to sort of experience more in working with designers.
Right. Did you want to add anything?
I wanted to add one more thing, because I remember something that's come up in our previous conversations that I just want to make sure we mention is that it really helps us humanize this.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right.
Like,
got there.
talk about that. Like,
you're right.
this is a human thing, so let's bring it back to people.
Yeah.
And I just I think that service design is a great way to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we really need to figure out new ways to live. Like, we're at a point now where we really have to rethink these systems. and redesign these systems. So I think service design is really well suited to do that.
Yeah, there's definitely been, we're gonna open it up, but there's definitely been an assumption that climate change is here and we are now adapting, right?
Mhm.
That's where we're at, so,
Mhm.
we need to acknowledge that. So, anyway, I have more questions, but it's now 7:15 and we wanna hear from the rest of you, so, great, question number 1. Yes,
Hey.
perfect.
I'm Glasha.
Hi, Glasha.
And I guess, so I'm a designer, also like a service designer, but oftentimes we say human-centered design, and
Right.
we just said it's a human problem, but
Yeah.
it's not just a human problem. It's a problem for animals. It's a problem just for like the earth in general. And
Yes.
so, how do you like incorporate stakeholders who don't have a voice, literally, into your design process?
Ooh.
Good one.
That's great.
We have to do a little ideation
Yeah.
on that.
And I mean, in my view, it's kind of selfish because my work in environmental justice, which is my entry point into this work, was that there's so many communities that don't have, so many humans that don't have voices that, I think is an important question, but I think my approach is, I just am concerned about the many people who aren't able to, but I think it's a great question that I don't have an answer to, but that was my initial reaction.
I think just really paying attention to natural systems, like go out to Point Reyes, go out to a beach like where you're just by yourself and like just feel like what's there and what you're sensing. And I think that's a way to kind of bring it in, is really to be in tune with what's going on with earth systems and patterns and stuff like that. That would be one suggestion.
Yeah, that's great. And of course, a lot of people are working on the non-human world and how to identify how. I was just in a call today about range shifts. Like, how can we project the shifts in various plant species? And people are really concerned about it and are working on it, and that's great. And I think there is a lot of opportunity to bring those two together. And in very urban environments, my kind of sense is, well, let's figure out how to have more opportunities of nature, kind of like Erin was saying, in our urban environments, because not only is it going to help us kind of physically with adaptation efforts, but also just psychologically, and let's bring that more into the space and give ourselves some nurturing as well.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, particularly in urban environments. So when you have young people, right, introduced to, because I'm from Atlanta, another like place where there was not a lot of places to hike or hang out, at least in the metro area. But anyway, getting more young people involved and aware of the environment helps to add voices to these other human elements, right? So, and I think that there's a big gap in urban areas in New York, and a lot of people thinking about environmental education and how to get young people involved and ultimately helping to solve for those problems outside of just the human-centered element.
So, okay. I'll get you, Greg. How about in the back there? You, the tall guy. Yes, you. Yes, you. I can't see your name. I'm sorry. Yes. No. Yes, you. Yes.
Okay. So you said that numbers are great, and I'm a technician, so I love numbers as well. But also, I think the empathy around that it's not just about numbers is so important. So how do you incorporate that in your daily work? How do you make that work? It's not just about the concrete numbers and the exact numbers, and sometimes you just have to assume something.
That's a good question. I'll take a first
You want to
stab.
say first stab?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. I mean, for me, I'm not a numbers person. So I automatically kind of go to the qualitative, and that's where the juiciness lies for me and gets me really excited. But in my work, people are really interested in that, and it is important as one element. I think my strategy is trying to work on communications around that. So how do we communicate that about uncertainty and kind of guide clients or folks who are doing this work to come to terms with the level of uncertainty that they're comfortable accepting and making decisions on. So kind of identifying what uncertainty do we need to be certain about, and what uncertainty are we okay accepting, and what can we do to get to that point. So make sure that we know everything we need to know to feel comfortable moving forward. But I think for me, the greatest strategy is to try to just communicate better and make people more comfortable with that.
Yeah, and this may be another non-answer to your question, but one way is to actually get the numbers to speak for humans. So like we just published an equity indicators report, Oakland. We're one of 5 cities to actually put a number to, people talk about race and equity, but like, oh, here is in this neighborhood versus that neighborhood, this has more kids getting asthma, or this has less financial institutions. So that's how we're measuring. So sometimes there's some people who are just going to be numbered focused, and I think that there's some room. And again, I'm an engineer and like numbers. There's some room to tell that story with numbers, with indicators, and I don't think a lot of people are really thinking about that. You know, like I said, we're one of only 5 cities that have put this together. But you know, I think the communication obviously is important, and making sure that you take that conversation outside of the data. But in some cases, there are ways for you to drive decisions around data by sort of, you know, finding ways to be quantitative about the human experience, and just a thought.
That's good.
Okay, so, yes, you and the tall man there standing in the back.
I just wanted to make a comment and see how people thought about this in terms of the scale of the solution adapted to the scale of the problem. I know we went straight into equity and city scale solutions. I mean, this is like an earth sciences catastrophe happening on a human time scale. And so, I mean, some of the things that science tells us we need to do is like draw down carbon dioxide and, increase survivability of human population areas and, go vegan, or, I mean, I think there's some well-known kind of first big impact levers that we can touch. So I didn't really hear anything about that. And then the other idea is that, perceiving the future that we all want to share together, I think is a great idea. I think the timeline is compressed with kind of 12 years before we hit the tipping point, and the huge disinformation campaign, and some of these issues like equity. I mean, we haven't solved that in the past few hundred years, so we're gonna have to solve it in 12. So just what are your thoughts on the scale of the solution for the scale of this problem?
So I'll start that. So I think participatory design is the key. Personally, I think when you think about scale, if I could, I would get a couple $1 million and like send designers across the state of California and like do this participatory design, service design work, because it's so important. And I think that's why I feel service design is so kind of well suited for climate change in particular, and thinking about different ways to live, because we literally have to redesign these systems that we're living with, and we don't have that much time, to your point.
Yeah. Like the economy and the political system.
Yeah, and I think it's also, so one point we didn't talk about too, that I found in my work in New York, is it's also really well suited to kind of bringing multiple stakeholders together across sectors, across scales. If you think about government, community, in strategic conversations. I mean, it was really interesting to see what happened when we had the Department of Health, Emergency Management, and community stakeholders in Red Hook at the same table. What can come out of that, right? So I think it's like designers can also create new configurations for this work, new business models. I mean, yeah, I think we really need these creative approaches now.
I'll just say one thing. I'm not gonna say anything. I'm gonna take another question. I want to respond to what you said, but I also want to get some other questions in. So, one.
I have a lot of questions, so I'm gonna try to pick one.
It's a big topic. It's a big topic.
I know. In alignment with what you're sharing, this is a huge problem. We need big solutions. We need to act now. There's so much pressure to mobilize now.
Yes.
And yet we're living in a political climate where things feel like they're completely stuck because we're diverging so significantly. There's so much lack of even sort of a moral compass in this country that I struggle with increasingly. that mean, you know, a lot of these issues that you're talking about, there's an underlying requirement to have a moral conscience and to sort of agree that the people who are suffering the most need the most resources, that we need to equitably redistribute wealth in this country, that we need to equitably redistribute support in all ways. And I don't know, it's a wicked problem like you said, but I'm just kind of wondering how you all deal with the complexity of that in your day-to-day, and how do you reconcile with like small incremental change versus massive revolutionary systems level change, kind of in alignment with that idea. It's a big question, but
I guess I have a couple of, one response is, if you look at any revolution, there's studies that show it wasn't because 100% of the people agreed. It wasn't even, I think the stat they have is like 60%. There's a graph and I'm trying to go off. So it's real. So the first step is just understanding the job isn't to get everyone to agree. And second, and it's, you know, I left DC to come here, so, and I was working in federal policy because I was at a place where, yeah, from a federal level, I just wasn't seeing, and I was working with some international, like, I just wasn't really seeing real change, and there were like amazing agreements, amazing ideas, large top-down solutions, but the people who have to do it are in the cities, they're in the neighborhoods. So to me, what keeps me able to do it every day is that I think the change is coming and the swell is going to come from the bottom, which it should, right? Like from the cities, from the neighborhoods, from the blocks. And it is, of course, very optimistic to think that that's going to happen on every block, but I think that's what I hold on to. And I'm able to see in my city and meet people and understand that their change is going to, not everyone, but enough to get to that tipping point. So that's kind of how I reconcile some of it, but yeah, I think everyone has to kind of go their own way. My faith helps too.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think just the situation we're in right now, just the lack of a moral compass,
Yeah.
right? So it's,
Greg, you want to go?
Yeah, it's specifically for Aaron. I think it's easy to see how the Earth being such an enormous system becomes difficult to perceive for each of us, right? Like, how can I really make an impact on that? But you mentioned that your students were having difficulty getting into it. How did you tackle that? Like, how do you take those first steps that allow them to like start thinking, okay, maybe we can do something to make a difference?
I took them to Red Hook and I took them to Lower East Side, and we did walking tours with neighborhood community organizers who walked them around the public housing and talked about the flood and the flood level and where it was. I mean, in Red Hook, we had this guy who made this flood map, and it was this amazing effort. Right after Sandy, went around and interviewed everyone in Red Hook to find out what their water level was, and then made this map. And so he took my students around and like literally showed them the water level was here. Oh yeah, and I was like in the road, you know, running through the water, and we had to worry about the electrical lines and things. And I think for them, like being there and understanding it and talking to people and being out in the neighborhood, that was a really, I think, kind of a really good way in, right? Because when you just show slides of data and things, and it's really hard to understand it.
So qualitative, okay.
Yeah.
It solves the problem.
What makes it tangible?
Thank you.
Ming, and then, okay. We've got,
Question. So, what would you say, each one of you say as 1 or 2 sentences to someone who's your friend or colleague who says, you know, climate change is just not a jam. I heard today, but I don't actually know what to say to you. But
climate change is just not
my jam.
Oh, right. Okay.
Real quick.
Is breathing
Well,
your
you're-
jam? That's one sentence.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
I guess the first thing that comes to mind is like, well, you're already a part of the sandwich, so like better kind of do something. Just like you're the peanut butter.
Yeah, and I think like getting someone to recognize something that's happened right around them, like where they live or their city. You know, that's another thing with my students. I asked them like, where do you live? How has climate change impacted your city? And they did research, and I think that's when it can really hit home in that way, tangibly. That's really important.
Yeah, kind of going off of questions around, like, have you seen any examples where participatory design has led to like someone changing their mind, or have you seen like a block by block change that has inspired you? Can you share that?
I have one, and quickly, so there's a game apparently, I wasn't here for it, but I've heard, there was a game that was played where literally the floor is the Bay Area, and you're surrounded, and to make your point, you stand in the Bay and talk about sort of what you're experiencing and what certain levels, what certain places may experience versus others. And I name all that to say, we were trying to come up with recommendations about where to spend this money, and some people came in and they were like, housing. Housing is number one. Some people came in, climate change, totally, and I've seen priorities change where it's like, well, there's only certain things you can do, and if we do this, then rising levels are gonna, so it was a very interactive kind of, I sort of rolled my eyes at first when I heard about a game, and I guess that's good design, so. But yeah, it actually got people to change their mind just by sort of being in this spatial place and delivering from, so I've seen, that's one example that I've heard about and it has worked.
Yeah, we use stakeholder mapping and then improvisation in our workshops, and people had so much fun. We got all these props donated from IKEA and things like, we just staged an apartment and then role played through different things, and it's a great design tool, but also people have so much fun doing it. One example here in the Bay Area is the Resilient by Design contest. So the Marin City team, the PSET team, they really worked with participatory design and a human-centered design process. And so look them up online. There's a video. Pandora she's a designer, and she kind of led that effort. She's a permaculturist, and that's a really great example to look at. And they brought like the community into the process of thinking about flood mitigation and what to do.
The game was Resilient by Design too, so yeah, for the East Oakland team, so yeah, let's check that out.
So we're a little over. Do we want to have one more question and then go solve climate change? Right? Okay. Who's got one more? Final.
You just spoke about stakeholders, and we had the beginning question talking about private, like people working in private companies and people working in government and people studying. So in your normal like day-to-day, what do you see and what do you see working or not working by looking at different scales of stakeholders? Because climate change is like this multi-stakeholder and multi-scale problem. So how much of a weight do you see between big private companies versus the neighborhood or like government entities or civic entities? Like what do you see normally happening?
I'll start with that. Yeah, that's a great question. I think it first depends on what kind of slice of climate change you're looking at. But I would say that there's a role for all. And even if you're looking at kind of one aspect of it, there are tiers and layers because it is stretching from the top to the bottom. So I think there's potential to engage with all of them. And I think the most exciting projects for me are when we can. So for example, we are kind of on the tail end of working on a new wildfire management plan for the state of Washington, and that has engaged stakeholders from the very local level, community members, community organizations, homeowners, all the way up to federal agencies, and it's a huge lift, right? It's hard to get people in the room, but that's where it gets really exciting, is when you do get the different layers of stakeholders talking together, because the people who are in maybe the corporations or at that higher level, when they're able to talk and actually hear from local community members on the ground about what that certain policy or approach, how that breaks down and creates problems in there, or what makes it really good and accessible for them. That's where kind of they put the pieces together and are able to kind of see where there are opportunities or potential challenges.
So it's great to come to these events, but we always want to do something.
And so we're also thinking about replying. So we have all your email addresses from the Eventbrite, so we can reply And then that's another way to find out about it. But you can also email me here. The email address is there, and come talk to us afterward. Yeah.
And
So-
if anybody is in the Practical Service Design Slack network, there's the #industry/climate that has recently been added. So join that and join the conversation.
Cool. All right, well, thanks a lot for coming. We appreciate it.